The pediatric wing smelled like lemon cleaner and leftover rain. I stood at the end of the corridor with a gift bag in my hand, a little blue blanket I'd knitted clumsily in a toy truck that looked like the one I used to drive for work. The floor shined so bright it held my reflection, a 58-year-old man in a faded denim jacket, hair going white at the temples, hope and worry twisting in the same pair of tired eyes. I'd timed my visit to miss the shift change, to keep the hallway quiet, to keep my nerves from rattling. My name is Max. I spent 3 decades pouring concrete, cutting joists, making houses stand when the wind decided to shove them. I've got hands like old rope and a back that tells the weather better than the news. My wife Linda used to say I was a full-time worker and a part-time poet because I'd talk to our son while we framed 2x4s, telling him how beams learn to hold what they love. Linda's been gone 3 years now. Cancer, if you must know. Some facts walk into a room and chair themselves like they live there. I paused at the door. The small window cut into it like a promise. Inside, machines glowed soft green, and I heard the smallest hum, the lullaby of a hospital that never sleeps. My grandson had come into this world with a heart that needed fixing. They said words like urgent, complex, high risk. I said yes to everything. Yes to the surgery. Yes to the bills. Yes to selling my truck, the one that was my bread and butter for 20 years. Yes to taking a loan from Rosa, my kid sister who runs a salon and keeps a ledger like a preacher keeps a Bible. $85,000 and all stacked like sandbags against a flood I couldn't let wash him away. I raised my hand to knock. It was shaking. Honest truth, I hadn't slept through the night in a month. I'd sit at the kitchen table reading the same paragraph in the same old paperback while the coffee went cold. The morning they wheeled my grandson back, I stood outside the operating room and prayed like a man who used to pray and forgot how. When the surgeon finally said he did great, I had to grip the railing because my knees felt like unpoured cement. The door opened from the inside. Jenna filled the frame, my daughter-in-law's sharp suit jacket, over a cream blouse that didn't dare wrinkle. Her hair was pulled so tight it made her look like a different kind of person than the one who cried thank you into my shirt 3 weeks ago. She didn't smile. She didn't move. I brought him something, I said. My voice found an old county road softness. Just wanted to sit a minute, maybe hold his hand. She glanced at the bag, at the cheap tissue paper, trying to look nicer than it was. Her mouth smiled, but her eyes were shut windows. Max, she said the word polished smooth, this isn't a good time. Is he sleeping? I asked, peeking past her shoulder. A tiny hand lay open on the blanket. I could see the pulse in his wrist like the tick of a small clock. It's not that, she said, and then she moved into the gap between us like a sliding door. We've decided it's better if you don't come in. The air went thin. Sound left the hallway, the soft beeps, the rubber soles, the nurse's distant laugh. I heard a memory instead, the last purr of my truck's engine as the buyer drove it off the pen, scratching across the loan form while my hand left a little sweat stain on the paper. I remembered Linda's voice, Max, don't give more than you can afford to lose, and how I'd told her in the dark that love is always over budget. Jenna, I said, I just want to see him. I swallowed. I helped. I stopped myself. You don't brag about carrying water when the fire's still hot. Still? The words felt like a splinter under my nail. I helped. Her expression tightened, polite and final, the way hospitals teach you to be. He's not good enough for us, she whispered. And then, seeing my confusion, added this whole look. The nurses talk. Family talks. We need to keep a certain standard now. For him. For our future. She gestured at my jacket, at my hands, at the years clinging to me like sawdust. Please understand. We don't want complications. I felt something tilt inside me. A book knocked from a shelf. Not good enough. The words rang like drop coins, cheap and loud. Behind her, my grandson yawned, the smallest yawn. I could almost feel his weight against my chest, the way I'd imagined warm, heavy anchors lifting. A nurse turned the corner, pushing a cart. She saw our tableau and drifted by quietly. The hospital hum, returned lights, whispers, rolling wheels, the mechanical cradle of it all. Just a minute, I tried again, softer than before. He doesn't even have to know I'm here. Jenna glanced down the hall as if waiting for permission from a place that didn't love me. "It's not happening today," she said. Then she stepped back into the room and closed the door. The click sounded like a judgment. I stood there with the gift bag in my hands until my knuckles went white. In the glass, my reflection blinked back, a man who'd lifted beams onto frames, who'd sold his truck without haggling, who'd signed his name 3 times to make sure a baby got to keep his tomorrows. Not good enough. I set the bag on the floor next to the door like a small altar. Then I turned and walked the long hallway past posters about hand washing and hope. At the elevator, I pressed the down button and studied the grooves in my palms. They look like blueprints now, the kind you only learn to read after everything collapses once. Max didn't remember leaving the pediatric wing. 1 minute, he was staring at the closed door, the gift bag sitting helplessly on the floor, and the next he was shuffling past the cafeteria, his boots heavy against the linoleum. He pushed open the side exit and the night air met him like a slap. The hospital's floodlights made the parking lot glow too white, too clean, while the November wind cut through his jacket. He leaned against a lamppost and pressed his forehead to the cold metal, trying to steady the storm inside. Not good enough. The words clanged inside his skull, louder than the distant ambulance sirens. He had been many things in life, husband, father, worker, provider, but never had he thought himself not enough. His mind drifted back uninvited to the day of the surgery. He could still see the sterile hallway, smell the faint bleach and coffee, hear the surgeon's voice delivering the cost estimate, like a mechanic listing parts. $150,000. More than Max had ever seen written in black ink. His son, Evan, had stood frozen. Jenna had wept into her silk scarf. Max had said simply, "I'll take care of it." And he had. He'd driven his old truck, the same one that carried lumber, groceries, and birthday presents for 30 years, to a used dealer and signed the papers without hesitation. He'd called Rosa his sister, who wired him 10 grand without a single question. He'd emptied the last of Linda's savings account, the money she had meant to use for retirement trips they never got to take. Every dime funneled into that sterile hospital to buy the boy another chance at life. And now here he was, banned from the very room where that chance had bloomed. He shuffled to a bench near the emergency entrance and sat. The cold seeped through his jeans, but he didn't move. His hands rested in his lap, palms up, scarred and cracked like the pages of an old ledger. He thought of Linda again, of her voice in the kitchen when Evan was still small. "You work yourself to the bone, Max? But promise me one thing, don't let them forget what it cost you." A group of nurses hurried past laughing, their voices warm against the icy dark. For a moment, Max envied their lightness. He imagined being invisible, part of the background hum instead of the man left outside his own blood's door. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Rosa. "How's the little one? Did you get to see him?" Max stared at the screen until his vision blurred. He typed slowly, his fingers stiff. "He's doing well. That's all that matters." He didn't tell her about Jenna. He didn't tell her the words that still rang like hammer blows. Another memory rose. Evan at 16, his first summer job. Max had carried the boy on construction sites, teaching him how to cut, how to measure, how to respect the weight of wood and steel. He'd thought then that every lesson was an anchor binding father and son together. But anchors, Max realized, can rust. The hospital doors slid open again. This time it was a young couple with balloons, the words "Get well soon" bobbing cheerfully in the cold. They passed Max without seeing him. He wondered if his grandson would ever know that his grandfather had sat outside shivering, while strangers walked in freely with their smiles and gifts. The rage came slow, not fiery but steady, like coals banking themselves for a long burn. He clenched his fists and unclenched them. He could feel something forming in that anger, not just grief, but resolve. Max looked back at the glowing hospital windows where shadows moved behind curtains. He wasn't allowed to part. He whispered into the night so low no one could hear, "They think I'm not good enough. Then one day they'll know exactly who kept him alive." And with that, he stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked into the dark parking lot. Each step echoed like a promise waiting to be kept. The night after Jenna's words, Max couldn't sleep. The house felt colder than usual, though the thermostat glowed its steady 70. He wandered from room to room like a man searching for something he'd already lost. In the living room, the recliner where Linda used to read sagged a little deeper without her. A stack of unopened mail leaned against the lamp. Max shuffled through it, bills, coupons, nothing urgent, until he came to the drawer at the bottom of his desk. He hesitated. His fingers hovered over the handle like it was a trigger. Finally, he pulled it open. Inside was the ledger of his life receipts, contracts, folded notes, scribbled in his wife's neat handwriting. Max slid the thick folder onto the desk and opened it. The papers smelled faintly of dust and coffee of years passed too quickly. There it was, the invoice from the children's hospital. $150, 0. He traced the numbers with his thumb. The memory flooded back. The doctor had been clear. Surgery was the only chance. Evan had slumped in his chair, white as the hospital walls. Jenna had cried silently. And Max, old tired Max, had stepped forward. "I'll cover it," he'd said, his voice steady. "Dad, you can't," Evan had protested, but Max already knew he would. He'd signed away the last of his truck that very day. His 2006 Ford, rusted but faithful, the one that had carried lumber, groceries, and Evan's soccer gear. Gone in exchange for a down payment at the hospital desk. Next came the loan, high interest but fast. Rosa had pleaded with him not to, but when he explained, she wired what she could. "He's your blood, Max," she said. "I just hope he remembers." Now, months later, his reward was being told he wasn't good enough to see the child he'd nearly bankrupted himself to save. Max flipped further through the stack. Wedding receipts, thousands he'd poured into Evan and Jenna's dream day. A check stub from the tuition bills he'd helped cover when Evan was laid off. Grocery bills from when they'd moved in, temporarily draining his utilities. Each slip of paper was a small scar proof of love, proof of sacrifice. He sat back in his chair, staring at the pile. His chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. He had given them everything. They had given him humiliation. The words Jenna had hissed replayed in his skull. "He's not good enough for us." Max picked up his pen. On a yellow legal pad, he began to write not a letter, not yet, but a list. Names, dates, dollar amounts. Every sacrifice cataloged in black ink. The pad grew heavier with every line, as if the weight of years was finally visible. At the bottom, he drew a line across the page. Under it, he wrote 4 words in capital letters: THEYWILLREMEMEBER. The old man leaned back, his eyes on the ceiling, his heart beating steadier than it had in weeks. He wasn't sure what form his revenge would take, not yet. But he knew one thing: it would be public. The world would see who had paid the price. And Jenna's cruel dismissal would not be the final word. As the clock ticked past midnight, Max closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer. He didn't lock it. He wanted to see it again, needed to see it again, like kindling waiting for a spark. For the first time since that hospital hallway, Max felt a strange sense of calm. Not peace, exactly, something sharper. A quiet gathering storm. The following Sunday, Max drove his old sedan down Maple Street to Rosa's house. His sister was 2 years younger, but carried herself with the gravity of an elder. The screen door creaked as he stepped inside, the smell of fresh coffee and baked bread filling the small kitchen. "Max," Rosa said, looking him over with concern, "you look like you haven't slept in a week." He didn't argue. Instead, he slid the yellow legal pad across her table. Rosa adjusted her glasses and read line by line the ledger of sacrifices Max had written out. She shook her head, her lips tightening with every page. "Max, this is your life on paper," she whispered. "And this is how they repay you, by locking you out of the hospital." Her voice trembled, not with disbelief, but with fury. Max nodded slowly. "Jenna looked me in the eye and said I wasn't good enough. After all this." He tapped the column showing the hospital payment. Rosa's hand gripped his. "They think you're weak. But you're not. You've carried this family since you were 20 years old. Don't let them bury you alive while you're still breathing." The words sank deep, stoking the fire inside him. For years, Rosa had been his quiet supporter, the one who urged him not to give too much. Now she was urging him to take something back. That afternoon back home, Max stepped onto his porch. Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor, was watering her petunias across the fence. She gave him the same kind smile she always had. "Max, you didn't look yourself this week?" she called. Everything all right for a moment, he considered brushing it off. But the words pressed at his chest until they spilled out. "They wouldn't let me see my grandson Helen. Said I wasn't good enough." The watering can froze midair. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened with shock. "Not good enough after everything you've done for them? I saw you, Max, driving off in that old truck after you sold it. I know what that money went to. And now they've shut the door in your face." Her indignation carried across the fence like a rallying cry. She set the can down hard. "Well, they may think you're alone, but you're not. Not as long as I'm still here. You want witnesses, Max? You'll have them. I'll stand beside you." For a long time, Max stared at the ground, the gravel crunching under his boots as he shifted. When he finally looked up, there was steel in his eyes. "Thank you, Helen. I think I'll need that more than ever." That night he returned to his desk. He opened the ledger again, ran his finger down the long list of sacrifices, and beside each line he wrote a new word, WITNESS. He circled Rose's name. He circled Mrs. Henderson's. And he left space for more. Because if he was going to strike back, it wouldn't be in silence. It would be in the open before eyes that could not look away. The church bell tolled softly across the empty streets as Max pulled his coat tighter against the autumn chill. The small stone chapel on the corner had been part of his life for decades. Baptisms, weddings, funerals. It was also the place Ellen had loved most, the place she had whispered to him on her deathbed, "Don't lose yourself when I'm gone." Inside, the sanctuary smelled of polished wood and candle wax. Pastor John, silver-haired and steady, was arranging hymnals when he noticed Max lingering by the aisle. "Max," he said warmly, walking over. "It's been a while since I've seen you here during the week." "Everything all right?" Max hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and unfolded the yellow legal pad edges, frayed numbers scrawled in his steady handwriting. He held it out silently. Pastor John adjusted his glasses and began to read. Tuition payments, mortgage, bailouts, hospital bills, car loans, even the cost of the very surgery that saved his grandson's life. When the pastor looked up, his face had changed. The softness was gone, replaced by a grave weight. "My God, Max, you carried all this. And now they've shut you out." Max's voice was low, hoarse, with both shame and anger. "Jenna blocked me at the hospital door. Said I wasn't good enough. After selling my truck, pawning Ellen's jewelry, signing every check to keep that boy alive, I wasn't good enough." The words echoed in the vaulted ceiling. Pastor John closed the ledger, slowly set it on the pew, and rested both hands on Max's shoulders. "There is a difference, Max, between forgiveness and letting yourself be trampled. You've given more than any father I know. Maybe it's time to show them what that sacrifice looks like in the light of day." Max swallowed hard. I mean, don't keep it hidden? Don't let them rewrite the story of your life while you're still here to tell it. Truth only heals when it's spoken aloud, and sometimes it needs an audience. For a long moment, Max sat there in silence, staring at the cross at the front of the church. He thought of Ellen. He thought of his grandson's tiny hand gripping his finger after surgery. He thought of Jenna's cold eyes as she barred the hospital door. Finally, he nodded. "Then I'll need witnesses. Rosa, Mrs. Henderson, maybe you too." Pastor John's lips curled into a solemn smile. "You'll have me, Max. Whatever you decide, you won't stand alone." Max left the chapel with the evening sun painting the stained glass in fiery colors. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders felt lighter, not because his burden was gone, but because he knew it would soon be seen. As he walked down the steps, he whispered under his breath, almost like a vow, "They called me a burden. Let's see what happens when the burden finally speaks." The next Saturday, Max drove slowly toward his son's house. The old pickup coughed at every stoplight, its rusted frame a reminder of what he had traded away for hospital bills. In the passenger seat sat a carefully wrapped gift, a hand-carved wooden train he had made for his grandson in the garage late at night when sleep refused to come. He rehearsed his words on the drive. "Don't fight. Don't accuse. Just see the boy just once. The neighborhood was buzzing with laughter. Cars lined both sides of the street, balloons bobbing from the mailbox at his son's home. It was a birthday party, his grandson's. Max's heart lifted for a moment. Maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe they had forgotten to call. He stepped out, smoothed his worn jacket, and carried the gift toward the door. But Jenna opened it before he could knock. Her smile froze when she saw him. "Max, what are you doing here?" He held up the gift, his hands trembling. "It's his birthday." "I just thought you thought wrong," Jenna cut in, sharply lowering her voice so the neighbors wouldn't hear. "This is a family party. You showing up would just complicate things." Max blinked. "I am family." She shook her head, her earrings catching the sunlight. "Not today. He doesn't even ask about you anymore." The words hit harder than he expected. He looked past her shoulder into the house where children laughed around a cake. His grandson's high-pitched giggle carried across the room, and for one raw instant, Max imagined the boy's arms around his neck, the smell of birthday candles, and frosting on his breath. But the door never opened wider. "I sold my truck," Max said quietly, the words slipping out unplanned. "I sold it to pay for the surgery that gave him this birthday. And you're telling me I can't?" Even Jenna's jaw tightened. She reached for the doorframe like she was bracing herself. "That was your choice. We didn't ask. Now please, Max, don't make a scene." The phrase, "don't make a scene," rang in his ears like a verdict. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at him with finality. "Go home." The door shut soft, but final, leaving Max alone on the porch with the wooden train in his hands. He stood there for a long time, the sounds of the party spilling through the windows, the warmth of family life that had once been his but now lay on the other side of the door. Slowly he set the gift down on the welcome mat. On the walk back to his truck, his chest felt heavy, but his mind for the first time clear. They thought he was invisible, disposable, forgotten. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine growling awake, and whispered to himself, "All right then. You want me gone. Let's see how you like living without me, without everything I've carried for you." As he drove away, the laughter faded behind him. Ahead, the road stretched long and empty, waiting for the plan he would soon set in motion. Max sat at the kitchen table that night, the same table where he had once paid bills with Ellen by his side. The overhead light buzzed faintly, throwing long shadows across the wood. In front of him lay an old shoebox, battered and dusty, filled with papers he had never thrown away. He opened it carefully, like a man opening a wound. The first document he pulled out was a hospital bill. The total circled in red ink, $83, 472.16. His throat tightened. That was the surgery, the one that saved his grandson's life. He remembered signing the papers, hands shaking as he pledged his truck as collateral. He remembered walking out of the hospital that night, the air bitter cold, but his heart warm because the boy was alive. Max laid the bill flat on the table. The next stack was a series of bank withdrawal slips. $2, 500 here. $5, 0 there. Each line was a piece of his retirement crumbling away. He recalled the nights he'd gone without proper meals, heating the house just enough to survive while quietly funneling the money to his son's family. He pulled out loan agreements signed with his neat handwriting. He could still hear the banker's voice, doubtful at your age. "Max, are you sure you want to take on this debt?" And Max had answered without hesitation, "It's for my grandson. That's all that matters." But it wasn't just money. At the very bottom of the box, tucked in an envelope, were photographs Ellen had saved. One showed Max in his work boots, covered in dust, grinning despite exhaustion. Another, the old pickup gleaming after he'd restored it with his own hands, the same truck he'd sold to pay the first hospital bill. His eyes blurred. Ellen had always told him to save everything just in case. Now he realized she had been right. This wasn't clutter. It was testimony. On impulse, Max fetched a thick binder from the closet. Methodically, he began slipping each document into plastic sleeves: hospital, invoices, bank slips, loan agreements, mortgage statements. With every page, he added, the binder grew heavier, as if absorbing not just paper but years of sacrifice. At the front, he slid in the photograph of the truck. At the back, the picture of Ellen smiling, holding their grandson as a newborn. Between those bookends lay the silent story of everything Max had given and everything that had been taken for granted. Hours passed. The clock struck midnight, but Max kept working his hands steady. For once, he didn't feel like a burden. He felt like a builder again, constructing something undeniable, a wall of truth no one could ignore. When the binder was full, he placed his palm on the cover and whispered to the empty room, "They'll know. One day soon, they'll all know." And for the first time since the cruel words at the hospital, Max allowed himself a small, grim smile. The next evening, Max dialed a familiar number. His younger sister, Rosa, answered on the second ring. "Max, it's late." "Everything all right?" Her voice had the same softness it always carried, but Max could hear the undercurrent of worry. For months she had sensed something was wrong, though he'd brushed her off each time. Tonight, he couldn't. "Can you come by?" he asked simply. 30 minutes later, Rosa was sitting in his kitchen, the same one where they had shared Thanksgiving dinners as children. The scent of coffee filled the room, but Rosa's eyes were fixed on the thick binder in front of her. "What's this?" she asked. Max pushed it toward her. Proof. Every dollar. Every sacrifice. She hesitated before opening it, almost afraid of what she'd see. But once the pages turned, her face hardened. The hospital bills, the loan agreements, the mortgage statements, all lined up in chronological order like silent witnesses. "Oh, Max," her voice cracked. "You sold your truck, you took out loans all for," then Max finished. "For my grandson. For the family I thought I still had." Rosa placed her hand over his, her eyes glassy. "And now Jenna shuts you out of the hospital after all this," she said. "I wasn't good enough," Max said quietly, staring into his untouched coffee. "As if money didn't come from these hands these years. As if my sacrifices were just nothing." Rosa flipped another page, her lips trembling as she read the totals. $150, zero, Max. You gave them your life savings. And they treat you like a stranger, Max nodded slowly. "That's why I'm done being silent. When the time comes, Rosa, they won't just see me as a burden. They'll see the truth. Every face in that hospital, every member of this family, they'll know who really saved that child's life." Rosa leaned back in her chair, the binder still open in front of her. She looked at her brother differently now, not just as the quiet, grieving widower, but as a man carrying a fire inside him. "You're serious," she whispered. "As serious as I've ever been," Max replied. "They think I'll fade away quietly. But Rosa, I'm going to make sure my last word in this family isn't silence." For a moment, neither spoke. The clock ticked, the coffee cooled, and the weight of the binder pressed heavy on the table between them. Finally, Rosa reached across, gripping Max's hand firmly. "Then I'll stand with you," she said. "When you show them, I'll be there. They won't be able to twist it or lie or call you bitter. I'll be your witness." Max exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time since Jenna's cruel words, he felt less alone. That night, as Rosa drove away into the dark, Max stood on the porch and watched her taillights fade. In his chest, a strange blend of grief and resolve settled. The betrayal still burned, but so did the plan. The binder lay inside on the table, waiting like a loaded weapon. And Max knew exactly when and where he would pull the trigger. The Sunday after Rosa's visit, Max put on his old flannel jacket and walked to St. Andrew's Church, the same one he and Ellen had attended for nearly 3 decades. The pews were half filled with familiar faces, neighbors who'd seen him raise his family, men and women who had watched his hands build half the houses in their town. After the service, Pastor John, a stout man with kind eyes and graying hair, caught him by the arm. "Max, you've been quiet lately. How are you holding up?" Max hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the cluster of families laughing near the church doors. "Not so well, John. Not so well." They sat in the small side chapel where stained glass filtered the afternoon sun into soft patterns across the floor. Max slid the binder of receipts and loan papers onto the pew between them. John frowned. "What's this, my proof?" Max said simply. "Proof of what I've given and how I've been repaid." As the pastor turned the pages, his expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief, then to quiet anger. You did all this for them, and now they shut you out of your own grandson's hospital room. Max nodded. They call me a burden. They want me gone. But when the time comes, John, I need people to know the truth. I need witnesses, people who won't let them twist the story. John closed the binder gently, his eyes steady. Max, I've seen you sacrifice for this town, for your family, for Ellen, for that boy. If you decide to reveal this, I'll stand by you. Not just as your pastor, but as your friend. Max's throat tightened. He clasped the pastor's hand, grateful beyond words. That same week, Max also confided in Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor who often brought him casseroles on lonely holidays. She sat at his kitchen table, clutching the binder with trembling fingers. "Oh, Max," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I always knew you were too generous. But this is your whole life in these pages." "They need to see it," Max said. "Not just my daughter-in-law, not just my son. Everyone. The doctors, the nurses, the family, the neighbors. I want them all to know who kept that boy alive." Mrs. Henderson straightened her shoulders, surprising him with her firmness. "Then you won't do it alone. When you call, I'll be there." By the end of that week, Max felt something he hadn't in months, a quiet army gathering behind him. Rosa, Pastor, John, Mrs. Henderson. Each had seen the proof. Each promised to stand as a witness. Max knew the moment of reckoning was coming. And when it did, he wouldn't be just an old man shouting at ungrateful children. He would be a man surrounded by voices of truth, voices that could not be silenced. That night, sitting by Ellen's old chair, he whispered into the silence, "They thought I was alone. But I'm not. Not anymore." Max sat at his worn kitchen table late into the night, the same table where he and Ellen used to balance bills over mugs of coffee. The binder of receipts lay open before him, but tonight he didn't just flip through it, he organized it with purpose. Each sheet, each payment, each loan was arranged in careful order: hospital bills, mortgage payments, tuition receipts, car repairs. A lifetime of sacrifice, reduced to numbers on paper. His calloused hands smoothed each page as if they were fragile pieces of his soul. Some were spotted with faint stains of grease and coffee, reminders of nights when he'd come home from double shifts, too tired to wash his hands before writing another check. Others bore Ellen's handwriting in the margins, neat and round, paid thank God. Max paused at one paper in particular, the hospital invoice for $47.00, the money he'd scraped together by selling his old truck and borrowing against what little savings he had left. That was the surgery that saved his grandson's life. He pressed the paper against his chest, his heart aching with both pride and betrayal. "Ellen," he whispered to the silence of the house, "they'll never admit it. But I'll make sure they never forget it." The plan was taking shape. He pictured it clearly now, not a quiet conversation, not a whispered plea, but a public reckoning. In the hospital's family lounge, where doctors, nurses, relatives, and neighbors often gathered, he would lay down the truth. Every page, every number, every sacrifice would be displayed for all to see. And then he would perform the act that would free him. He went to the fireplace, the same one where he'd once roasted marshmallows with his kids, the same one that had warmed so many Thanksgivings and Christmas mornings. With a trembling but determined hand, he lit a small flame and fed in a crumpled electric bill he had once paid for his son. The edges curled, blackened, and dissolved into ash. Max watched, his breath steady. There was something purifying about it. The fire didn't just consume the paper, it consumed the years of silent suffering attached to it. He tested another page, a tuition invoice, and the flame devoured it just as eagerly. For a brief moment, the room smelled of burning ink and old dust. Max felt lighter, stronger, but he stopped himself. Not yet. The real fire, the one that mattered, would come later, when they were all watching. That would be the moment they could no longer call him useless, no longer dismiss him as a burden. He closed the binder, tying it shut with a rubber band, and slid it into the drawer of Ellen's old writing desk. Next to it, he placed a box of wooden matches. The stage was set. As he turned off the light and climbed the stairs to bed, Max's reflection in the hallway mirror caught his eye. For the first time in years, he didn't see a tired, lonely old man. He saw a builder again, a fighter. "They thought I was finished," he murmured to himself, his jaw tightening. But I've still got one last thing to build the truth. The next morning, Max rose before dawn. He hadn't slept much, but his mind was steady. The sun crept over the horizon, spilling pale gold light across the neighborhood, yet the warmth outside didn't touch the heaviness in his chest. Today he would try again to see his grandson. He carried a small gift in his rough hands, a wooden toy car he had carved himself its surface, sanded smooth, painted in bright red and blue. His grandson Ethan had always loved cars. The boy would sit on the living room rug, pushing his toy trucks back and forth, pretending the floor was an endless highway. Max could still hear his little voice giggling "Vroom, Grandpa, vroom" at the hospital. The sterile scent of disinfectant filled his nostrils as he walked down the long corridor. Nurses passed with clipboards. Families sat slumped in waiting chairs, faces lined with worry. Max's boots echoed on the polished floor until he reached Ethan's room. His heart lifted for a moment when he saw the door slightly open, a sliver of light spilling out. But standing just inside was Jenna. Her arms were crossed tightly, her lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. She blocked the doorway like a sentinel, eyes narrowing when she saw him. "Max," she said, her voice icy. "What are you doing here again?" Max swallowed, holding out the small toy car. "I made this for Ethan. Just a little something to cheer him up. I just want to see him, Jenna. Just for a minute." Jenna's eyes flicked to the toy, then back to Max with disdain. "He doesn't need that. And he doesn't need this." She gestured toward him as if he were some unwelcome intruder instead of the man who had sacrificed everything. Her words cut sharper than any blade. "I'm his grandfather," Max said, his voice low but firm. "I was there the day he was born." "I sold my truck. I took loans. You did what you thought was best," Jenna snapped, interrupting. "But that doesn't mean you belong here now. Ethan is recovering, and we don't need you hovering around making things uncomfortable." The same word his son had once used, uncomfortable. Max's chest tightened. He looked past Jenna, catching just a glimpse of Ethan's small figure in the bed, a stuffed bear by his side. The boy stirred, murmuring something in his sleep. The sight nearly broke him. "Please," Max whispered. "Just let me sit with him. I won't say a word." But Jenna only shook her head. "No, Max. It's better this way. For all of us." She stepped forward and pulled the door shut, the click of the latch final like a verdict. Max stood frozen in the hallway, the toy car still in his hand. He stared at the polished floor until his reflection blurred through the sting of tears. Around him, the world carried on, nurses, hurrying monitors, beeping, but for him, everything had gone silent. Slowly, he placed the toy car on the chair outside Ethan's room. His fingers lingered on it a moment longer, as if he could leave a part of himself there with his grandson. Then he straightened, squared his shoulders, and walked away. Each step grew steadier than the last. Jenna's cruelty no longer weakened him. It hardened him. As he reached the hospital's main entrance, he caught his reflection again in the glass doors. And this time, he didn't see a man begging for scraps of affection. He saw a man preparing for war. Max drove home from the hospital with the same heaviness in his chest that had accompanied him for weeks, but this time it was heavier still. By the time he reached his small house on Maple Street, the toy car he had left outside Ethan's hospital door felt like an anchor lodged in his chest. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears. He moved to the kitchen where the table still bore faint scratches from years of Ethan playing with crayons and toy trucks when he visited. Now the boy was barred from him by the very people Max had sacrificed everything for. He sat down, rubbing his rough hands together, staring at the faint grooves in the wood. And then, without warning, the tears came. He hadn't cried like that since Ellen's funeral. It was Rosa who found him later that afternoon. His younger sister had a way of knowing when to show up unannounced, and today was one of those days. She knocked twice and let herself in, holding a small bag of groceries. "Max," her voice called gently. He quickly wiped at his face, straightening up in his chair. "In here." When Rosa entered the kitchen, she set the groceries down and studied him closely. Her eyes narrowed the way they always had when she sensed her big brother was hurting. "What happened?" she asked softly. Max sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Jenna shut me out. Again. She said, I'm not good enough for them. His voice broke on the last word. Rosa's hands clenched on the back of the chair opposite him. Not good enough, she repeated, her voice rising. After everything you've done for them, after selling your truck, taking out loans, Max, you saved Ethan's life. Max gave a tired shrug. Doesn't matter to them. All they see is an old man who doesn't fit in their picture. Before Rosa could respond, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor from across the street. She was a widow 2 older than Max, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She carried a pie in her hand, still warm, the scent of cinnamon and apples filling the kitchen as she stepped inside. I thought you might need this today, she said, simply setting the pie down on the counter. Max managed a weak smile. You always know. Mrs. Henderson glanced from Max to Rosa, reading the tension in the room. Tell me, she urged gently, sliding into a chair. So Max did. He told them everything, the phone call, Jenna's cutting words at the hospital, the way the door had closed in his face. His voice was low and heavy but steady. By the time he finished, Rosa's face was flushed with anger. This is cruelty, Max. Pure cruelty. You gave them everything and now they treat you like this? No. They don't get to erase you. Mrs. Henderson nodded firmly. Your story deserves to be heard, not whispered about behind closed doors. They should be ashamed, and everyone should see the truth. Max looked between them, his chest tight. What good would it do? They'll never admit it. That's the beauty of truth, Mrs. Henderson replied, her eyes locked on his. You don't need them to admit anything. You just need to show it. Out loud. Where everyone can hear. Max leaned back, Rosa's words and Mrs. Henderson's echoing in his mind. For months he had carried the shame silently, but now for the first time he felt the faint stirrings of something else, something harder, sharper. Resolve. He didn't know exactly how yet, but he knew he would not stay silent much longer. That night Max couldn't sleep. The ceiling above him was just a blank slate. But in his mind it replayed Jenna's words like a broken tape, he's not good enough for us. Finally, around midnight, he got up. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the old wall clock Ellen had bought from a yard sale 20 years ago. Max walked into his small office, turned on the lamp, and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a faded accordion folder, the kind most people use to keep taxes in order. For Max, it was more than paperwork. It was the story of his life. He hadn't touched it in years, but tonight he pulled it out, set it on the table, and opened it carefully, as if unsealing a vault. The first envelope he withdrew was thin, but inside were loan papers. He remembered the day he signed them standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of a credit union. The ink on his signature had bled slightly where his hand trembled. He could hear Ethan's monitors beeping in the IC. You could see his daughter-in-law's tears when the doctor explained that surgery couldn't wait. We'll find a way, Max had promised. And he had. Next came the bill of sale for his old pickup truck. That truck had been with him for 18 years, carrying him to job sites, hauling lumber, moving furniture when his son and Kaitlyn got their first apartment. He could still smell the sawdust and leather from its cab. Selling it had felt like losing a limb, but he'd walked away from the dealership with cash in hand, enough to cover what the hospital insurance wouldn't. Max laid the papers on the table one by one, his hands steady now. University tuition receipts, credit card statements, checks he'd written to cover bills when Jeremy had been unemployed. Each slip of paper wasn't just proof, it was memory. A flashback. There was Kaitlyn at 8 years old, dancing in a new pair of ballet shoes he had saved for by working Saturdays. There was the memory of Christmas morning when Ethan tore into gifts under the tree, his laughter echoing in the house Max had worked his hands raw to maintain. And there was Ellen, her voice gentle, telling him, don't give them so much that they forget to be grateful. He had ignored her warning. By the time Max finished sorting, the table was covered. It looked almost like a case file prepared for trial. Each document lined up, each date clear. Proof that for decades his sacrifices had built the foundation beneath their lives. He sat back in his chair, staring at the mountain of evidence. His heart hurt, yes. But beneath that hurt was something new, a grim satisfaction. If Jenna thought he was not good enough, if his children believed he was disposable, then these papers would tell the truth. Not in whispers, not in private, but publicly, loudly, where everyone who mattered could see. Max leaned forward, stacked the documents neatly, and slipped them back into the folder. Tomorrow he would begin deciding exactly how to use them. He turned off the lamp and let the house return to silence. But this silence felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a plan. The next morning, Max stood in his kitchen with the folder pressed against his chest as if it were a shield. He had carried it upstairs with him after a restless night. And now the question gnawed at him. Should he keep this to himself, or should someone else see he didn't want pity? But he knew one thing: revenge in silence wasn't enough. If Jenna and his children thought they could quietly erase him, then he would need witnesses when the truth came to light. So Max made 2 calls. One to Rosa, his younger sister, who had stood beside him through decades of hardship, and another to Mrs. Henderson, the widowed neighbor who had often brought him meals when she saw his lights burning late. By afternoon, they both sat at his kitchen table. Rosa was still in her nurse's scrubs, her hair tied back her face, weary but alert. Mrs. Henderson wore her knitted cardigan, her eyes kind but sharp like a woman who missed nothing. Max spread the papers out across the table. "I need you both to see this," he said quietly. At first, neither woman spoke. Rosa picked up the bill of sale for the truck and ran her finger along the faded ink. "You sold your pickup for this," her voice cracked. Max nodded. "For Ethan's surgery. They don't even remember." Mrs. Henderson studied the loan papers, her lips pressing together in disapproval. "You mortgaged your own comfort to save that boy's life. And now Jenna blocks you from seeing him," she said. "I wasn't good enough," Max whispered, the words tasting like ash. Rosa slammed the paper down. "Not good enough? You've been carrying them for years. Every dollar, every sacrifice, it's all here." She swept her hand over the table, the documents spread like evidence in a courtroom. Max looked between the 2 women. "I don't want to just tell them. I want the world to know. I want the truth laid bare, where no one can twist it." Mrs. Henderson leaned back in her chair, arms folded. "Then don't do it in anger. Do it with dignity. Let the papers speak louder than your pain." Rosa nodded fiercely. "And don't do it alone. I'll be there. We'll both be there. If Jenna tries to dismiss you, she'll have to dismiss all of us who saw the proof." For a long moment, Max didn't speak. He felt the burn of tears behind his eyes, but held them back. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he didn't feel entirely invisible. "Then it settled," he said, his voice steady. "When the time comes, you'll stand with me. They wanted me erased. But instead they'll watch as everyone sees who I really was and who they really are." The late autumn light poured through the kitchen window, illuminating the papers like they were sacred texts. Rosa reached out, covering Max's hand with hers. Mrs. Henderson followed, 3 hands stacked together over the sacrifices of one man. For the first time, Max felt his loneliness lift. The revenge he was planning would not be carried out in shadows. It would have witnesses, truth, and justice. And this time, Jenna wouldn't be able to sneer, "He's not good enough." Max lay awake that night, staring at the cracked ceiling in his quiet house. The words Jenna had spit at him, "He's not good enough for us," still clung to his ears like a curse. He had sold his old pickup truck, taken out loans, and even pawned Ellen's wedding ring to cover the first wave of hospital bills. Yet now, when the boy was breathing and recovering, he was treated as though he were poison. For weeks he had tried to shrug it off, to convince himself that patience and kindness would bring healing. But the wound only deepened. He saw the way neighbors whispered when Jenna strolled past in her designer heels, pretending she had orchestrated the baby's survival. He watched her post smiling photos on social media, captioned, "Grateful for family support during this hard time," never once mentioning his sacrifice. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was theft. Theft of truth. Theft of dignity. Max realized something. Silence was no longer mercy. It was permission. If he stayed quiet, the lie would become permanent. His grandson would grow up never knowing that his grandfather's sacrifice kept him alive. That thought was unbearable. So he began to plan. The hospital was the natural stage. The same walls that had seen his worry, his desperate bargaining with God, would now witness his truth. He pictured it clearly, Jenna standing in the family lounge with her parents and Jeremy's colleagues, smiling, pretending she was the one who had held everything together. The doctors and nurses who had worked tirelessly, the very staff who had watched him count crumpled bills in the payment office, would all be there. That was the moment. The place. The public square where truth could not be erased. He would not shout. He would not curse. Instead, he would reveal calmly with documents, with receipts, with proof. Humiliation, he knew, didn't need noise. It only needed light. Max spent the following days quietly gathering evidence. He opened the dented lockbox under his bed where he had kept everything: hospital invoices, receipts from the pawn shop, the transfer forms from selling his truck. He placed them in a neat folder, labeling each page with dates and amounts. Every number was a scar on his hands, a story of labor and sacrifice. But paper alone wasn't enough. A performance needed witnesses. He called Rosa, his younger sister, who had sat with him through Ellen's chemo years ago. "Rosa," he said softly, "I need you at the hospital next week. Not just as my sister, but as a witness." She hesitated, then sighed, her voice trembling. "Max, are you sure you want to go through with this?" "They've erased me," Max replied. "This is the only way I'll still exist in my grandson's story." Rosa agreed. Next, he visited Pastor John, who had baptized his grandson only a year earlier. "I need you to stand with me," Max said, his voice low but firm. "When I speak, I want someone of integrity there to hear it. Not for me, but for the truth." The pastor studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "The truth deserves a witness, Max. I'll be there." By the end of the week, Max's plan was complete. He chose the exact moment carefully, the scheduled family gathering to thank the medical staff, organized by Jenna herself. She had sent invitations even to distant relatives, framing it as a celebration of her strength during a difficult season. Max would attend quietly, folder in hand. And when the moment came, when Jenna stood beaming with her carefully rehearsed gratitude speech, he would step forward. He pictured it, the pause in the room when he cleared his throat, the shifting eyes of relatives who had half believed Jenna's stories, the surprise of the doctors and nurses suddenly recalling the man who had quietly paid the bills in the finance office late at night. And then his words, simple but final: "It wasn't Jenna. It wasn't Jeremy. Every cent that saved my grandson came from me. My truck, my loans, my life savings. I gave it all, not for applause, but for love. And now you know the truth." That night, as he set the folder down on his dining table, Max whispered to Ellen's photo, "This isn't revenge out of hate. It's justice out of love. Our grandson deserves the truth, and they deserve the shame." He closed his eyes, breathing steady for the first time in weeks. The battlefield was chosen. The allies were in place. The proof was ready. The storm was coming, and this time Max would not be silent. Max had always believed in preparation. As a builder, he knew that no wall stood without its foundation, no roof without its beams. Revenge, he decided, was no different. If he was going to reveal the truth, it had to be done right. Public, undeniable, unforgettable. He spent the morning at his desk, the folder of papers neatly stacked in front of him. Each document was a nail in the coffin of Jenna's cruelty. The truck sale receipt, the hospital bills with his signature at the bottom, the loan agreements that still smelled faintly of ink. He organized them into a binder page, protectors tabs, even a cover sheet that read in bold letters what love paid for. Rosa arrived that afternoon, setting down a thermos of soup she'd made after her shift. "You're really going through with this," she said, her eyes scanning the binder. "I've lived my life building things," Max replied. "This time, I'm tearing down a lie." Mrs. Henderson joined them not long after, carrying a tray of cookies. "If you're going to make this public, Max, you'll need more than papers. You'll need people there. A moment where everyone can see." Max nodded. He had already been thinking of the setting. Not at home. Not in the quiet of a kitchen argument. It had to be somewhere that echoed, somewhere Jenna couldn't silence him with a sneer or a slammed door. "The hospital," he said finally. His voice was steady, but his hands tightened on the binder. "Where Ethan was saved. Where I spent nights praying outside that room. That's where the truth belongs. Rosa's eyes widened. In front of the doctors, the nurses, everyone in front of anyone who needs to know, Max said, "They've painted me as weak, as a burden. But when they look at me after this, they'll see what I carried on these shoulders. And Jenna won't be able to bury it." Mrs. Henderson gave a thin smile. "Then we'll make sure the right ears hear it." Word spreads fast in a community. Once you speak, the walls themselves will carry your truth. That night, Max sat alone in his living room, the binder resting on the coffee table. He poured himself a glass of water, stared at the flickering lamplight, and whispered into the quiet Ellen, "If you were here, you'd tell me not to waste my breath. But you'd also remind me that dignity isn't something you give away, it's something you claim. Tomorrow I claim it." He could almost hear her laugh, soft and knowing. He closed his eyes, letting the memory steady him. The plan was no longer just a thought. It was written, organized, and waiting for the right moment. For the first time since Jenna's cold words at the hospital door, Max felt the strength of a man who knew the ground beneath his feet, and he was ready to shake it. The hospital corridors had a sound all their own. Shoes clicking against linoleum, the steady beeping of monitors behind closed doors, the low murmur of nurses exchanging notes at their station. To most people, it was the sound of sickness and waiting. But to Max, it was the sound of salvation, the place where his grandson Ethan had been pulled back from the edge. And tonight, it would be the place of truth. Max clutched the leather binder under his arm as he entered through the sliding glass doors. The cold November air followed him in for a moment, before sealing shut behind him. Inside, warmth, fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of antiseptic clung to the walls. His palms were damp, but his steps were steady. Every corner of the building held a memory. He could still picture himself in the emergency room lobby 6 months ago, pacing the floor as surgeons fought for Ethan's life. He remembered the doctor's weary smile when she told him the boy would make it. He remembered Jenna arriving hours later, clutching her designer purse, not once asking how the bills had been paid. Tonight, she would know. They would all know. At the reception desk, a young nurse smiled politely. "Visiting hours are almost over, sir." "I'm here to see Ethan Miller, Max," said his voice, calm but firm. "I'm his grandfather." The nurse checked the chart. "Room 412. But she lowered her voice. "Families already gathered. Might be a full house." Max offered a thin smile. "That's exactly why I came." As he took the elevator to the 4th floor, he saw his reflection in the steel doors. Gray hair, deep lines carved by years of work, a man older than his years. He straightened his posture, gripping the binder tighter. He wasn't here as a broken old man. He was here as the one who had paid the price of their survival. The doors opened with a chime. The hallway stretched ahead, hushed, but alive with movement. Nurses glided from room to room. Families spoke in whispers, carrying flowers and balloons. Max felt eyes on him as he walked past. He carried a secret that weighed more than any bouquet. Room 412 stood at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. He could already hear voices inside, laughter, soft chatter, the sound of life going on as though nothing had ever been risked. He caught Jenna's sharp, familiar tone. "Isn't he the sweetest? He looks so much like Jeremy when he sleeps." The sound clawed at Max's chest. She had said those words while barring him from the door, while calling him not good enough. He tightened his grip on the binder. A few steps closer, and he saw them through the crack. His son Daniel leaning against the window with arms folded, Jenna perched near Ethan's bed, her face glowing under the fluorescent lights. Jeremy, his tie loosened, spoke to a cousin Max, barely recognized. A crowd had gathered, relatives, friends, even Dr. Patel, the surgeon, stood quietly at the side, a respected figure in her white coat. It was perfect. A stage set without their knowing. Max inhaled deeply, the weight of the moment pressing down on his chest. He thought of Ellen, of the nights she would whisper, "Don't let them take your goodness for weakness, Max." He pushed the door open. The voices dimmed instantly. Heads turned. Silence fell heavy. Jenna's smile froze. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, standing quickly as though shielding the boy from his own grandfather. Max stepped inside, binder in hand, his voice low but steady, "Coming to see the life I paid for." The room went still. This was no longer just a visit. It was the beginning of the reckoning. Coming to see the life I paid for. Max's words lingered in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Every eye in the room was fixed on him. Daniel's brow furrowed, uncertain whether to speak. A cousin whispered under her breath, "Even doctor." Patel's quiet posture shifted, her arms crossing her gaze, sharpening as though she sensed something heavy was about to unfold. Jenna recovered first. She took a step forward, her chin lifted high, her polished smile gone. "Max, this isn't the time. You're upsetting everyone." "I'm upsetting you," Max said evenly, his voice steady but loud enough for all to hear. "Not them." Jeremy moved beside her, his hand on her elbow, trying to diffuse the moment. "Dad, maybe you should don't call me Dad." Max cut in, eyes blazing. "You only use that word when you need something from me." The air in the room shifted. Family members straightened in their chairs, leaning closer. Daniel stiffened by the window, silent guilt written across his face. Jenna's voice sharpened like glass. "You don't belong here, Max. You've always been too much. Too rough, too old-fashioned. Ethan needs stability, not someone who barely takes care of himself." A murmur ran through the room. Dr. Patel's lips pressed into a thin line. Max took a step forward. The binder still clutched to his chest. "Not belong here," his voice cracked but grew stronger with each word. "That boy, my grandson, wouldn't be here if not for me. You want to talk about who belongs? Let's talk about the night he almost died." Silence. Even Jenna blinked. Max opened the binder, the leather creaking. From it, he pulled out a stack of papers, neat and worn with handling. Receipts, hospital statements, loan agreements. He held them high. When the doctor said the surgery had to be done, who do you think they called? Who signed the papers? Who drained his savings, sold his truck, borrowed from neighbors, just to keep the machines running? Gasps rippled through the room. A cousin covered her mouth. Dr. Patel nodded slightly, her gaze confirming his words. Max's voice grew louder. $150,000. Every cent. Mine. Paid in sweat and blood and sacrifices you don't even know how to spell. And yet he slammed the papers down on the rolling table by the bed, startling even Jeremy. "You dared to look me in the eye at that door and say, 'He's not good enough'?" The words struck like a hammer. Jenna's face flushed crimson. She sputtered, searching for control. That's not what I meant. You're twisting things." But the room wasn't with her anymore. A neighborly aunt in the corner whispered, "Lord have mercy." Daniel's head dropped into his hands. Dr. Patel stepped closer to Ethan's bed, her expression unreadable but firm. Max leaned forward, his voice low, trembling, not with weakness, but with the force of years suppressed. "I buried my wife, Jenna. I raised my son with nothing but calloused hands and borrowed time. And when life demanded more, I gave even what I didn't have for him." He gestured toward Ethan, the child sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm outside his dreams. "And you would erase me, pretend I don't matter, not today. Not anymore." The room felt as if it had no air. No one spoke. Max's words hung heavy, undeniable. And for the first time since Ellen's passing, Max did not feel small. He felt seen. For a moment, the hospital room was a battlefield of silence. Max's words still echoed against the pale walls, heavier than the steady beep of Ethan's heart monitor. Jenna's face was flushed crimson, her jaw working like she wanted to fight, but the room no longer belonged to her. Aunt Louise was the first to break the silence. She rose slowly from her chair, her voice low but carrying. "Max, is that true? You paid all that?" Max turned his gaze toward her, steady and unwavering. "Every cent. Sold the truck I drove for 20 years, borrowed from neighbors, cashed out what little retirement I had left. I didn't ask for applause. I asked to be allowed to love my grandson." Louise's eyes brimmed with tears. She shook her head at Jenna. "How could you keep him from the boy after that?" Jenna snapped, her voice sharp, desperate. "This is between us. Family business." "You don't understand," but Dr. Patel stepped forward, her tone calm yet firm. "Mrs. Collins, when a man sacrifices his financial security, his livelihood to save a child's life, especially his grandson's, that's not just family business. That's the definition of family." The words landed like a gavel. Jeremy shifted uneasily. His polished composure cracked sweat, gathering at his temple. "Look, everyone, this is getting blown out of proportion. We just wanted what was best for Ethan. That's all." Max's eyes narrowed. "Best for Ethan, or best for you, you wanted me hidden away. Out of sight, out of mind, while you lived off the sacrifices I made." He gestured toward the papers lying on the tray table. "There's the proof. There's your burden, Jenna." The room tilted further. Rosa, Max's sister, who had been sitting silently by the window, stood now with trembling hands. "I told you," she said, her voice shaking with both anger and pride. "I told you. Max was the one keeping this family together. You kids," her eyes cut toward Jenna and Jeremy. "You're the ones who should be ashamed." Jenna's lip curled. She tried to retake control. "Shame you think we should let him meddle forever? He's old. He doesn't enough." Daniel's voice finally broke, raw and unsteady. He stood up so suddenly his chair scraped against the linoleum. His eyes darted between his father and his wife, torn in two. I can't defend this anymore. Dad's right. Everything he said is right. I knew about the loan. I knew he sold the truck. And I let you," his voice cracked. "I let you convince me it was easier to push him away. The dam burst." Jenna's control faltered, her face twisting with rage and fear. "Daniel, don't you dare!" But Daniel pressed on, his voice louder now. "I was wrong, Dad. God help me, I was wrong." His eyes welled with tears. He turned fully to Max, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry." The room was no longer Jenna's arena. She looked around and found nothing but stares, some pitying, some condemning. Even Jeremy took a subtle step back, as if distancing himself from the fallout. Max straightened, shoulders square. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the discarded old man, the one to be tolerated and pushed aside. He was the center. He was the truth. Jenna cornered, spat the only thing she could. "You'll regret this, Max. You think humiliating me will fix anything?" Max's reply was quiet but sharp as steel. "I'm not the one who should regret anything. The humiliation had begun, and it was only going to get worse." The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, but the real electricity in the hospital room came from the people inside. Jenna stood cornered, her designer heels digging into the linoleum, her face tight with panic. The words Max had spoken about the truck, sold the loans taken, the sacrifices made, still floated in the air, impossible to erase. Dr. Patel folded her arms, her sharp gaze never leaving Jenna. "Mrs. Collins," she said firmly, "I've seen hundreds of families in this hospital, but I've rarely witnessed a grandfather go to such lengths for his grandchild. And I've certainly never seen a family try to erase that sacrifice." It was a verdict, though softly spoken. Rosa, standing near Ethan's bed, reached out and gently placed her hand over the boy's tiny one. "You see," she whispered to the room, as though narrating the obvious truth. "Even now, Ethan trusts his grandpa. He feels safer because Max is here." The sight was symbolic, a quiet transfer of trust, a line drawn against Jenna's icy walls. Jenna's eyes darted wildly, seeking some ally, some shred of defense. She landed on Jeremy, but he only shook his head, muttering, "You went too far, Jenna. Too far." Daniel, still trembling from his confession, stepped closer to his father. His face was pale, but his voice steadier now. "Dad, I'm sorry. I knew what you had done for Ethan. I should have stood up for you." For Max, the apology was salt and balm mixed together, painful in its lateness, but healing in its honesty. He simply knotted his throat too tight for words. Louise, who had always been careful to avoid family disputes, surprised everyone by rising to her feet. Her hands clenched the edge of her cardigan as she spoke, voice rising in anger. "Max isn't just family. He's the backbone of this family. Without him, there would be no home, no safety, no Ethan here today. And you, Jenna, you had the nerve to shut him out, to call him unworthy, the nurses lingering by the door whispered to each other. Even the janitor, pushing his mop, paused, his eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. The humiliation was no longer private, it was a public reckoning. Max, feeling their stares, stepped toward the small metal cart by the bed where he'd set down the folder of receipts. His calloused hands, steady now, reached into the folder and pulled out a folded piece of paper, one of the bills from the hospital itself. He raised it high for everyone to see. This, he said, his voice strong, is what family looks like. Not words. Not promises. Sacrifice. Real bleeding sacrifice. Then, with deliberate slowness, he tore the paper in half. The sound echoed sharp and final, like a gavel striking. Gasps filled the room. The act wasn't about money, it was about proof, about showing that betrayal could never erase sacrifice. Jenna flinched, her eyes brimming with tears, not of guilt, but of humiliation. She tried to form words, but the room was no longer hers to command. Dr. Patel gave a small nod, almost ceremonial. Mr. Collins, she said, addressing Max with respect that made him stand taller. You've made it clear who truly stood for Ethan. No one here will forget it. Daniel lowered his head, ashamed. Rosa squeezed Ethan's hand tighter. Louise dabbed her eyes with a tissue. And Jenna, once so sure of her power, was now exposed under the weight of truth and community judgment. Max, for the first time in years, felt the air in his lungs expand freely. He was no longer silent, no longer sidelined. He was a man whose life had meaning, and whose sacrifice could not be erased. The humiliation had begun to settle on Jenna like ash after a fire, and Max knew the blaze was far from over. The room, already heavy with silence, shifted again when a small sound rose from the hospital bed. Ethan stirred, his pale cheeks flushing faintly, his eyelids fluttering open. The boy had slept through most of the storm, but now his voice, weak yet unmistakable, cut through the tension. Grandpa, the single word spoken with fragile sincerity, landed like a thunderclap. Heads turned. Nurses froze. Rosa gasped and leaned closer to steady him, but Ethan's eyes were fixed only on one person, Max. Jenna stiffened. Sweetheart, you need to rest, she said quickly, trying to press him back against the pillows, as if she could smother the truth with a mother's command. But Ethan, gathering every ounce of strength in his small body, shook his head faintly. His lips trembled as he whispered again, I want Grandpa. The room erupted not in noise, but in the silent acknowledgement of a child's raw honesty. There was no manipulation here, no politics, no hidden agendas. Just a boy calling out for the one person who had saved his life. Daniel's face crumpled as though someone had struck him. His son's voice shattered the last defenses of denial. Daddy muttered hoarsely, turning toward Max, he's asking for you. For a moment, Max stood, rooted disbelief and emotion warring in his chest. He had imagined this moment countless times in his quiet house over his late-night prayers to Ellen, but to hear it aloud in front of everyone was almost too much to bear. Rosa touched his arm gently. Go, she urged. Max stepped forward, his boots slow against the tile. Jenna moved instinctively to block him, her hand snapping out like a shield. He's weak, she hissed. He doesn't know what he's saying, but Dr. Patel's voice cut in like a scalpel. Mrs. Collins, she said sharply, your son has spoken clearly. He wants his grandfather. If you interfere again, I'll have security escort you out. The words landed with brutal finality. Jenna froze, her hand hovering in the air before she pulled it back, trembling. The humiliation in her eyes burned red, but she had no choice. She stepped aside. Max approached the bed and sank into the chair beside Ethan. His calloused hand, hesitant, at first reached for the boy's small fingers. Ethan's grip, though weak, closed around him with surprising strength. I love you, Grandpa, Ethan murmured, eyes wet, voice soft but steady enough for everyone to hear. The sound broke something in the room. Louise sobbed openly into her tissue. A nurse covered her mouth with her hands. Even Jeremy, who had once followed Jenna's lead, so easily lowered his gaze in shame. Jenna, trapped in the circle of witnesses, bit down hard on her lip. Her authority was gone. Her son had chosen, and he hadn't chosen her script. Max bent closer, his forehead nearly touching Ethan's. "I love you too, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking with decades of sacrifice, loss, and unconditional devotion. The boy smiled faintly before drifting back into a gentle sleep, still holding his grandfather's hand. In that moment, the entire room saw the truth, not in words or documents, but in a child's instinct. Ethan had exposed what no speech could love, cannot be bought, rewritten, or denied. Max straightened slowly, his eyes sweeping across the room. Every gaze met his with respect, and every gaze avoided Jenna's with quiet judgment. The humiliation was complete, not by Max's hand, but by the voice of the very child Jenna had tried to use as her weapon. The ripple that Ethan's small voice had set in motion didn't fade, it grew rolling through the hospital room until it spilled into the hallway beyond. Nurses, visitors, even relatives who had been lingering in the waiting area began whispering. Word spread fast. The boy called for his grandfather, the one who paid everything, the one who had been banned from the room. By the time Max stood from Ethan's bedside, the hallway was full. Rosa was there, standing with two cousins who had rushed over when they heard the commotion. Mrs. Henderson from across the street had even come, her hands clutching a basket of soup she'd meant to deliver for comfort. All of them looked at Max, not with pity, but with pride. Dr. Patel, still firm and unflinching, stepped forward and addressed the group in a clear, professional voice. "For those who may not know," she said, glancing pointedly at Jenna, "this man, Maxwell Hayes, is the reason that boy is alive today. He sold his car, took out loans, and signed every check that covered Ethan's treatment. Without him, none of us would be standing here celebrating Ethan's recovery." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some gasped, some nodded slowly as the truth settled like stone in the pit of their stomachs. All eyes turned toward Jenna, who stood stiff, her face, pale lips pressed into a thin line. Mrs. Henderson's voice rang out sharp as glass. "I saw Max drive that old truck until it coughed smoke just to save money. And you," she pointed directly at Jenna, "had the nerve to tell him he wasn't good enough." Louise Daniels' aunt stepped forward, tears streaking her cheeks, but her voice steady. "We all thought you were helping him, Jenna, but now we see. You've been taking and taking, and the moment he needed love back, you shut the door in his face." Daniel stood, frozen shame burning across his cheeks. He opened his mouth to defend his wife, but no words came. The truth was too clear, too raw. Max, though, didn't raise his voice. He simply held up a stack of faded receipts he had carried in his coat pocket: hospital invoices, loan papers, the title transfer for his old car. He laid them on the nurse's station counter one by one, like a quiet testimony written in sacrifice. "These," he said, his voice calm but steady enough to fill the hall, "are what a father does when his family needs him. I didn't ask for thanks. I didn't ask for applause. I only asked to see my grandson." The hallway went utterly still. A nurse dabbed at her eyes. Rosa placed a hand over her mouth, whispering, "Oh, Max," and then, like a spark in dry grass, the silence turned into sound applause. First from Louise, then from Mrs. Henderson, then from the nurses who had watched Max come and go quietly these past months. The clapping swelled until it filled the ward, echoing off the walls like thunder. Jenna shrank back, her face flaming. She tried to speak, tried to protest, but her words were swallowed in the roar of hands slapping together for the man she had tried to erase. Max didn't smile. He simply lowered his head, tears stinging his eyes, and looked once more at Ethan, sleeping peacefully, with a faint smile still on his lip. For Max, this wasn't about humiliation. It was about truth laid bare for everyone to see. The humiliation, though, was undeniable. Jenna stood in the center of it all, her reputation stripped away by the very community she had tried to manipulate. And Max, for the first time in years, he felt something deeper than anger or sorrow. He felt justice. The applause faded, but the echo lingered in Daniel's chest like a drumbeat he couldn't quiet. The crowd began to disperse, though their looks of disappointment toward Jenna clung to the air like smoke after a fire. Ethan's name and Max's sacrifice were still being whispered down the hall. Daniel stood there rigid, his hands buried deep in his pockets, as though hiding them would steady the tremor in his fingers. His wife had already slipped back into the room, avoiding every gaze, clutching her purse like it was armor. Dad, Daniel finally said, his voice low, almost hoarse. Max turned slowly. His face was calm, but his eyes told another story, a storm just barely held back by restraint. He had hoped for years that his son would see him as more than just the old man who built houses and patched broken fences. Tonight, Daniel had to choose. "You should have told me," Daniel muttered, his eyes on the floor. "All those bills, the loans, the car, you carried that alone." Why, Max's answer came without hesitation. "Because that's what fathers do. I didn't want my son weighed down by numbers on paper. I wanted him to be free to live his life, raise his boy, and feel safe." He paused, his gaze hardening. "But safe doesn't mean entitled. And love doesn't mean silence when I'm treated like I don't matter." Daniel flinched at the words. His throat worked, but no reply came. Memories rushed in the long nights. He remembered his dad stumbling and covered in dust, his hands cracked from cement and wood, still carrying groceries in the other arm. The Christmas mornings Max had built with his bare hands, the train set the treehouse, the new roof over their heads, when a storm had torn it apart. And now the stark image of Jenna standing before his father in that hospital doorway, cutting him down with one cruel sentence, "He's not good enough for us." Daniel pressed his palms into his eyes, breathing hard. I don't know how to fix this." "You start by telling the truth," Max said quietly. "To yourself, to your wife, to your boy. You stop pretending I'm a burden, and remember that I've been your backbone from the start." The silence between them stretched. Then Max took a step closer, his voice dropping softer, the edge giving way to weariness. "I don't want a war, son. I want respect. If you can't give me that, then don't give me anything. But don't you ever let that boy think his grandfather wasn't there for him." Daniel's eyes finally lifted. For the first time in years, he saw not just his father, but the man beneath, the one who had built, sacrificed, and carried the weight of a family on shoulders that were now stooped but still unbroken. The door to Ethan's room opened slightly. The boy's small voice, groggy but insistent, drifted out, "Dad, Grandpa, can you both come in?" Daniel's breath caught. He looked at the door, then back at his father. In that moment, torn between blood and bond, between his wife's pride and his father's truth, Daniel realized his next step would decide more than just family peace. It would decide what kind of man his son would one day become. Max waited, silent but steady. The choice was no longer his to make. The hospital corridor had grown quiet, the late-night buzz settling into soft echoes of machines and muted footsteps. Inside Ethan's room, Daniel finally walked in beside his father. He hadn't spoken yet, but he didn't need to. The act itself, standing shoulder to shoulder with Max, was enough to make Jenna's face harden and her excuses falter. Ethan smiled weakly from the bed, his small hands reaching out. One for his dad, one for his grandfather. And for the first time in years, Max felt the fracture in his chest begin to mend. Jenna sat stiffly in her chair, her cheeks still burning from the public humiliation she had endured earlier. No more whispers, no more pretending. Everyone knew the truth now. The doctor, the neighbors, the extended family, they all saw who had carried the burden and who had nearly destroyed it with pride and greed. Max leaned down, brushing Ethan's forehead with a kiss. "You rest now, buddy. You're the reason I kept fighting. Always remember, family means showing up even when it's hard." The boy nodded, eyes drooping with sleep. His small voice murmured, "I love you, Grandpa." Those words washed away years of hurt, more powerful than any courtroom speech or bank statement. They were enough. Later, as Max walked out of the hospital into the crisp night air, the stars above seemed brighter. He had faced betrayal, endured humiliation, and stood his ground in front of the world. Tonight, his dignity was restored, not because he sought revenge alone, but because truth had finally spoken louder than lies. Daniel followed a few steps behind, quiet, humbled, and perhaps ready to rebuild what he had nearly lost. Jenna lingered in the shadows, the weight of her shame, her own to carry. Max paused at the hospital steps, exhaling deeply. For the first time in years, he felt free. He wasn't just a burden, wasn't just the old man in the corner. He was a father, a grandfather, and most importantly, a man who refused to be erased. And as he walked away into the night, there was no bitterness in his stride. Only strength, only peace. Dear friends, thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it touched you, if you felt even a little of Max's pain and triumph, please share it with someone who might need the reminder dignity is worth more than gold. We wish you health, happiness, and warmth with your loved ones. Treasure your family, and may your days be filled with love and respect. Thank you for watching, and may you and your families always be blessed.